to the channel. Today we're going to talk about connecting Power Virtual Agents, Microsoft's new conversational bot service, with its new RPA service known as UI Flows, which can be found inside of Microsoft Power Automate. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about building enterprise bots using a low-code approach, which is found inside of Power Virtual Agents. The other thing I want to call out is that this episode is essentially a continuation of episode 002, which was connecting Power Virtual Agents to ServiceNow using Power Automate. What's different about this episode versus that one is here we're going to focus more so on the UI flow side of the conversation. We're still going to use Power Virtual Agents in order to invoke this UI flow, but we are going to focus more so on the UI flow content. So if you're new to Power Virtual Agents, I do suggest you go check out that video where I will go through things in more detail, especially around the authentication piece. I'm not going to really cover that in this video. So let's talk a little bit about why this content is important. Now, number one, UI flows provide makers with another option when it comes to integrating with other systems, especially legacy systems. Now, naturally, Microsoft Flow, Power Automate, its roots involve these connectors, which are great. Like there's over 290 different connectors that allow us to connect to different systems. When you have the choice, you should absolutely be using those connectors. Those connectors are based upon APIs and OpenAPI/Swagger, so you have a tight contract, and that is the most robust way to connect and to communicate with those systems. However, some systems may not have APIs, especially legacy applications. And in those situations, UI flows might be a perfectly good approach to solving that problem. And another thing is when you don't have an API and you are dependent upon UI flows, you're essentially going to go ahead and emulate the behaviors or the steps that a human would ordinarily provide. So for example, in today's episode, we're going to take a very shady legacy timesheet entry application, and we are going to use UI flows to drive that web application. Now, that is opposed to me, an end user, having to go punch that data in manually. So that's an important distinction when it comes to UI flows. Now, in this case with Power Virtual Agents, the chatbot's not going to directly invoke the UI flow. We still need to have a regular flow in between these two services. And the reason for that is that UI flows essentially show up as a connector inside of Power Automate flows. And so what we'll do is we'll expose a regular flow to our Power Virtual Agent service that it can call. And then as part of that flow, we are going to include a call UI flow action that we can then go to invoke that part of the process. A couple other things to know about when it comes to UI flows is you do need an on-premise data gateway. So that is the only way that you can go ahead and run your UI flow. And the reason for this is, remember, we talked about UI flows emulate end user behaviors, which means you have to have some sort of runtime for that to take place. This isn't going to take place in the Microsoft cloud. Rather, this is going to take place on some local machines. Now, these machines, it could be a laptop, it could be a server, inside of your organization. It, in theory, could also be a VM running in Azure. But bottom line is you still have to have that on-premise data gateway installed in order for that execution to take place. In addition, there's a couple other prerequisites that we need. There's a Power Automate Chrome extension. And when we say Chrome, that also includes the new Chromium version of Edge. You can use either one of those web browsers, but ultimately it has to be Chrome-based. And then there's also a Selenium IDE extension that is required for running UI flows against web applications, and that's what we're going to be using here. Selenium, if you're not familiar with it, its roots come from essentially doing automated testing by recording different actions on a screen and then ensuring or providing assertions to ensure that those steps were executed correctly. Microsoft is using Selenium when it comes to recording those essentially macros against web applications. Now, also, I'll call this out now early in the video, is that we're only going to focus on the web aspects of UI flows. I'm not going to cover desktop in this video, perhaps in an upcoming episode. Another caveat I will make is that UI flows are also currently in preview. There is no costs that have been published at this point. I fully expect that there will be costs. This will be a service you will have to pay for. I will not speculate what those costs are because those have not been shared at this point, but just something to be aware of. But all in all, this is a really exciting piece of technology come from Microsoft. RPA is huge. You've got a lot of these vendors that charge an awful lot of money for this functionality. And I think one of the challenges for those organizations is that they're able to handle a lot of this like web scraping and GUI scraping functionality, but they don't have this vast array of connectors that exist inside of Microsoft Flow or Power Automate. And I think that's what makes this technology very special. And what gets me excited is the ability to sort of bring these two worlds together, the world of legacy and sort of those existing applications, and then the new world where we've got things like APIs and Swagger and custom connectors. And it's really the ability to bring those two worlds together, which I think is really exciting. As I mentioned on the previous slide, we do need to use a regular flow in order to invoke a UI flow. So just a sort of a quick recap if you haven't seen the previous video. So from our Power Virtual Agent conversation or that design surface, we have the ability to use the call in action operation, which will allow us to either create a new flow or to call an existing flow. Now, there are some prerequisites when calling a flow from Power Virtual Agents. Number one, that flow has to be in a solution. And if it's not in a solution, it's not going to show up on our list over here. The trigger that will be used for that flow is an HTTP trigger. And we can include parameters, so we can use the JSON schema or provide a sample message for all of the different inputs that we want to receive from the chatbot. And then as a result, on the Power Virtual Agents design surface, we will get prompted for all of those different inputs. It's actually a pretty slick experience. I like it. So as a result, we're going to call using HTTP. So it's pretty natural to expect that we will respond with HTTP as well. Now, do note this has to be valid JSON. When this list is being populated at the design time, there's some validation going on. And if your response, your HTTP response at the end of your flow doesn't include valid JSON, it actually won't show up in this list. So if it's not showing up in this list, this is your checklist to go through and make sure that your flows meet all of these different prerequisites. If they do, you'll be able to select it and then basically go ahead and call it. So here is an overview of our high-level architecture. So we're going to have an end user who's going to try to submit their timesheet. They don't know like where they submit their timesheet, so why not give them a guided experience? Obviously, it's going to be a simplified example. So they're going to be communicating with this Power Virtual Agent as part of an enterprise bot scenario. Then what we're going to do is we're going to expose a flow which is going to act as sort of our middleware between our UI flow and our chatbot session. As part of this, we're going to expose an HTTP trigger. There's going to be some inputs that we want to receive in the flow, like the project, the date, the hours that they want to book time to. We are also going to include their auth token. So as part of Power Virtual Agents, we have the ability to get their authentication token, and we will use that to look them up inside of Graph so that we actually get all of their details. And that way we can actually log that timesheet against their identity. Once we have the details from Graph, we'll then go ahead and call our UI flow. And as I talked about that earlier, that's going to actually run on our on-premises infrastructure. In this case, it's just going to be my local machine, but we've got the data gateway installed, and that's how our flow is going to communicate with that runtime. Once we've submitted the timesheet, we're going to basically get the response off of the web application and then return that indicator to our chatbot so that they know that their timesheet has been submitted successfully. So let's go ahead, let's jump in and take a look at a demo. So let's run through the demo as is, and then what I'll do after is I'll actually go through each of the components to demonstrate or show you how everything has been wired up. So let's start off in Power Virtual Agents. This is our canvas where we can go ahead and build our bot. Now what I have here is I have a topic called Submit Timesheet. So anytime any of these phrases or something similar to them gets provided to the bot, that's going to be its cue to basically start up this conversation or this dialogue. And so what we'll do is I'm going to run this, and let's run this from one of the different channels that are available to us. And so here we're just going to go and click on demo website. We can copy this out and paste. And we're just going to use essentially the test harness or test tool that's provided by Microsoft. So we can go ahead and click or type in hi just to sort of wake up the bot. And it's going to come back with sort of generic greetings. And then I'm just going to say log time. And now it's asking me to log in. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. Now I'm going to have like a session cookie in my browser. If I'm running this for the first time, I'm naturally going to have to put in my username and password. But I can go ahead and use this token and then paste it into my chat session. At this point, I've now been authenticated, and the Power Virtual Agent actually has my auth token, which it can pass to Flow in a subsequent step. So it's asking me now, would I like to submit a timesheet? And the answer is naturally yes. I need to choose a different project, right? Which project I want to book this time to. I'm just going to say I was working on support. And in this case, I want to book it for today's date. And then how many hours? And I'm going to say I worked 8 hours today on support. So at this point, the bot is actually going to kick off our flow. And here we can see some of the references of the UI Flow infrastructure here. So we're actually going to launch this ugly timesheet application, and then you're going to see that there's data being populated in all of these fields. And then we basically hit the submit button, and that actually has basically executed that flow. So let's just go ahead and take a look at the flow side of things here. And here we can see that this was kicked off essentially 29 seconds ago. And you will notice that it does take, probably 30 seconds for everything to sort of cool down and basically to see that this has actually been completely executed. So in this case, we would have received a request over HTTP, included like the project, the date, how many hours we spent, the auth token, and then we're going to go ahead and get user details from Graph. So we can see that in this case, it was me that had submitted this information or this request. We're then going to go ahead and parse that out just using a parse JSON just so we have typed data. And then we can go ahead and pass all of these inputs to our UI Flow and have that kicked off. So here we can see the first name, the last name, the date, the name of the project. And then what we'll do is return a response of success, which was what actually occurred inside of the web application. So let's just go ahead and click on edit just to give you a better sense of the design time experience here. So what happens is we're going to be prompted to provide the name of a UI flow. And so here I've got something called bot submit time web, and there's going to be a connection that is related to this. So in this case, this is a connection related to my on-premise data gateway. So that's how it knows sort of what machine to reach out to. And then here I've got information that's coming from my graph call, and then information that was provided from my inputs from the actual chat session itself. And then we'll just rewind a little bit just to show you this. This is the graph call. So when the token was provided in, I'm going to basically use that token to call the me operation as part of Graph API. So this is how it's going to think that I'm actually Kent Weir, and I'm going to use that token to essentially validate myself. So then, that completes sort of our flow side of the house. So let's take a look at our UI flow. So now what we're going to do is we're going to click on edit, and when we do so, the Selenium IDE is going to actually pop up for us. Now these are all of the steps that has been executed. And so how you go about recording a UI flow is you go ahead and you essentially hit on the record button. And when you do that, the website that you configure to launch is actually going to launch, and you're going to basically be able to go through all of your steps. So in my case, I would have hit record, and it would have prompted me with the web application. I would have had to put in all of that information: first name, last name, project, date, hours, etc. And then so what happens is, you've got all of this static data, and that's no good, right? So we'll see values of here would have said Kent, and then last name would have been Weir because that's what I had typed into the web browser previously. So I can go ahead and basically replace those static values with essentially parameters. So it's really just $sign and then whatever you want to call this. And this is how we actually have those parameters on the flow side of the house. When I selected this specific UI flow, it said, hey, I'm actually expecting that there's a first name that needs to be provided. That's how it actually knows about that. And then same thing with our outputs. So in this case, once we've gone ahead and provided all of the inputs, we click the submit button, and then what we're expecting is we're expecting to see a value that shows up in a label. And this label is called LBL status. And what we can do here is we can use this command called store text and then provide essentially an output variable name. In this case, I'm calling it submission status. And so this is then going to store the output into this particular variable. Now, naturally, we can go ahead and we can test this, and I'm going to slow this down just so that it doesn't go by so quickly. So I'm going to hit play, and then what's going to happen is our web application is going to launch, and we're going to see these values. Now, we're going to see essentially these parameter names being inputted because that's currently what is configured inside of the bot itself. And so once it's done, then this thing naturally is going to close. We can then save our Selenium IDE session, and that essentially becomes our UI flow. Right? And then here at the bottom, we can see that our test was completed successfully. Now we can go ahead and tweak things. What you're going to find is when you record these UI flows, there's going to be maybe extra steps that you don't want included, and you can actually go ahead and say right mouse click and say delete. The other tip I'll give you is as you're recording these things, you might get the first, say, 5 steps right, and you don't have to redo those 5 steps in order to record your 6 steps successfully. You could always go ahead and right mouse click and say record from here. And this will basically replay those previous 5 steps, and on the 6th step, that's where it's going to then invoke the recorder, and you'll be able to continue from that perspective. So here we would now go ahead, now that we've cleaned everything up, we've debugged it, we can go ahead and just hit save, and that's going to kick us back over to the UI flow. We don't really have a whole lot of additional things that we can do because Selenium is really sort of the driver behind the execution of the UI flow. Now let's just head back over to Power Virtual Agent, and I'll just show you what that design surface looked like. So we can go ahead and click on our authoring canvas. Now if you haven't seen Power Virtual Agents, it does look very workflow-ish, which is pretty cool. We can see the trigger phases, which we talked about before. Here's our authenticate action. So when we basically drop this action in, our user is going to get prompted for authentication, and then Microsoft's going to provide essentially this condition for us. It's going to store our auth token in our text variable. We will then go down the is logged in path, and then we're going to start asking questions. Do you want to submit a timesheet? Yes or no? And we're going to have these options because we're choosing multiple choice options here. If we wanted to include cities, numbers, continents, we have all of these different options that we can include. In this case, multiple choice options is great, in part due to we don't want people to have to type a lot when they're in the bot. So if we can reduce the keystrokes, that's a good thing. Now in this case, we do want to submit our timesheet. It's equal to yes. If they would have answered no, we'll just respond back with, have a nice day, life's good. And then we're going to want to get more information from them, like what is the project that you want to book against? So here I chose support. What's the date? So here we're going to say date and time. If I would have put in something garbage related, it can now validate that that's a valid date time. So we don't want to be passing or polluting downstream systems. So that's pretty cool. Here's where we go ahead and we call our flow. Now, how I would have done this is I would have clicked on call an action, and then here's where we have all of our different flows that meet those requirements or prerequisites that we talked about before. That is where we would go ahead and call that. Because we included that basically request body in our flow trigger, we have to provide all of these different values. And so here we're basically retrieving values from our previous question. So for example, when you create a question, how many hours, we're going to have the output stored in a variable. We can actually rename the variable if we want, but then we need to provide it as an input here. And then lastly, when we're done calling our flow, we're going to have an output. We showed that output, and we can store that output. In this case, it was called ticket number. I should really rename it. I used this in a previous bot with ServiceNow. But then we can basically go ahead and display that ticket number, or basically that response back to the bot conversation itself. Now in our bot conversation, here it is here, success was the value that was returned from the web application. And then here I've got some additional text saying your timesheet was submitted with a status. So that's where we see here your timesheet was submitted with a status of, and then this is the value that is returned back from our flow. So I hope you enjoyed that episode on how we can integrate UI flows with our chatbot conversations. If you do like this content, I encourage you to go ahead and hit that like button, provide a comment, please subscribe to the channel, that's greatly appreciated. Feel free to reach out to me over Twitter. You can follow me at Weirzy. And then in addition, I do have other content on Power Automate / Flow and Azure Logic Apps, and that content's available on Udemy. So feel free to go ahead and visit that URL where I provide discount codes where you can save a couple bucks. So thanks again for checking out my content, and I'll see you next week as I'm really pushing to have a new video out every Monday. So appreciate the support, and we'll catch you later, and thanks for visiting my channel.